Hello and welcome to Drive Retro Longplay, where this time out we're going to be taking a more in-depth look at the Lancia LC2, and I'm going to do a race in rFactor 1 and then a bit of testing around Donnington in GTR2, just because these are a couple of other mods for games where you can drive the LC2. I'd recommend that you give it a go. Now, just so you know, the version of the mod I'm using here is the Sports Prototype version 2.2 League Edition. I've got no idea if this is the most recent version, but given that rFactor is as old as it is, I would like to think it's the most up-to-date version that there is. It's got a really good selection of cars from across the Group C era, so this is not 100% representative of the field that you would have had back in 1983 through 86 when the Martini liveried car would have run. So before anybody comments that why can they see the 91 winning Mazda in the background, that's the reason why. So this is probably one of the more comprehensive mods, so it's got a nice selection of cars, so I thought let's give it a go, why not. So the reason for this video, when I've already done a video on the LC2 already, is just to give a slightly longer format video where I talk about the car in a bit more detail, do a race with it, show you some of the other mods that are available, and generally kind of flesh out what I've discussed previously. So it also gives me the opportunity to do a bit more background on the car, bring some other sources in, and just generally do a bit more about what I think is a fantastic looking car, and certainly worthy of discussion, which doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with the race results. That's really one of the things I want to talk about in this video, and going forward on the channel I want to look at some other interesting and unique cars, and just have a look at their history, why they came about, why they were or weren't successful depending, and to to give you a bit more background information. So we're doing a rolling start, but because the pace car has just got to peel off, we bunched up a bit and I nearly went into the back of the Nissan in front, but just about managed to avoid it. So now that the field has taken off, full power over the start line, climbing up all the way above 180 miles an hour before on the brakes into turn 1. Now I'm using the 1985 version of Monza because this would have been probably as close to the track as you could get for when they ran the Monza 1,000 kilometers during the mid 80s Group C era. So this is the car and the track, even if the field has a few cars that are a little end up a little far in the future. Because this is the League Edition, all the cars should have basically the same performance, it's just the skins that are different. So realistically, I've taken this car on a 6-minute 18-second lap of the Nürburgring, whereas the qualifying time for the 83 race was, I think, 6:41, and obviously Stefan Belov managed to take that the Porsche 956 round and qualifying 6 minutes 11. So I don't feel too bad being 7 seconds off Belov's time. I know people can go faster, but don't treat this as necessarily being representative of the Lancia's out and out pace. It's more indications of Group C as a whole, and given that a lot of that were basically Porsches of the 956 and 962 variety, actually it's not too bad a compromise. So completing the end of lap 1, we're going to try and launch an attack on the Nissan into the first chicane. I will point out that I've stuck the difficulty on 100%, and have also gone ahead and put the aggressiveness up to 50%. So I am expecting these guys to get their elbows out. So yeah, there may be a bit of punting going on at some point. So hopefully I don't get nerfed off into the scenery. So you can already see there's a bit of banging wheels going on there. as the Nissan makes a move for third place. So to talk about the Lancia in a bit more detail, this car looked great, sounded great, really quick, 13 pole positions across 51 starts, and bearing in mind that not all of those would have been with the Works outfit, because the car was a Works project from 83 through to 86, and from 87 through 91 it would have campaigned as a privateer but with no factory support, so very unlikely to beat the other cars out there. So ultimately that strike rate is a bit better than you would imagine from the numbers. However, then you get to the number of races that the car actually won, and that was 3. Yep, count them, 3 races that it won across the whole of its career. And when you actually dig down into that, the only time that the car actually won a race with what you could argue was a top class field to beat in front of it was the 1985 race at Spa. And if you know your Group C history, or your motor racing history in general, as the Mazda decides to go into space at that point, if you know your history, you're going to know that was the race where unfortunately the F1 and sports car driver Stefan Belov sadly lost his life in a terrifying crash with Jackie Ickx at Eau Rouge. So even though Lancia won that race, that doesn't really get talked about. The other 2 races that they won were not with a field that would have been representative of Group C competition normally. So, for example, they won the race at Kyalami, but the 2 Lancias were so far ahead of the competition that the second place car was 40 laps ahead of the privately entered Skyline that finished in third. So the only other proper competitive car was a privateer Group C Porsche, which suffered problems and didn't trouble them all day. So of those 3 race wins, only one of them could actually have been said to have been representative of sort of winning against a proper field of competitors. So why then do we have a car that apparently had the speed but couldn't carry its pilots to the finish? So I'm going to have a look at a few areas. I'm going to look at the driving staff. I'm going to have a look at basically how the car was constructed, and also how it was campaigned at the time, and some other factors that were basically shaping the way that Lancia went sports car racing. Before I do that, I'm going to attempt to overtake that Nissan and try and get a run. Oh, there we go. That was what I feared. The aggression turned up, a bit of a punt from behind, and off I go into the kitty litter. Try and get back on the road, do a bit of a Vettel, sort of turn into people, and we'll just gloss over that. That wasn't my finest driving moment. So I am not a professional sim racer. I hasten to add, I'm a semi-talented amateur. I think would be the best way of looking at it. So I enjoy this because I'm primarily a historian. I love car racing. Have done ever since I got into it in the late 80s, as I get rather unceremoniously punted off the road by that Porsche. So this is from a little later in the race, after I've got going again. I try to unsettle the car ahead of me and wind up taking myself off the road this time. I can't even say that it was revenge for my previous episode, because it was a different car. But anyway, I do cut the footage a few times just because there's a few laps where I managed to drive without either throwing it off the road or overtaking anybody. So we're going to gloss over that for the most part. So having picked it back up to speed, I'm now going to pick up the story of the LC2 while you continue to watch me generally have a bit of an up and down day round Monza. So coming to the drivers, normally you can sometimes point to the drivers being the weak point of a of a particular setup. And certainly when you're looking at sports car racing, where you actually have to have 2 or 3 drivers per team in a lot of cases, certainly when you're running Le Mans, maybe less so when you're running the other classics. But again, I get punted off the track and then fail to get back on it again. In this case, you don't have that problem. Lancia, for all the other faults that I'll come on to in a little while, were able to assemble some of the finest talents in racing at the time to drive these cars. They pretty much, it was a who's who of Italian motorsport royalty at the time. So you ended up with, for example, the car was originally campaigned by Piercarlo Ghinzani, who later went on to drive for Sella, amongst other teams. You then, in later years, had Riccardo Patrese, who we know from obviously his long and storied career in F1, Michele Alboreto, likewise, Alessandro Nannini, who was again a top-line Grand Prix driver before a helicopter accident that ended his F1 career. He later went on to be successful in touring car racing. Andre De Cesaris, who, for all that we know him as De Grasseris from his F1 days, was blisteringly quick on his day, and certainly was very well regarded in terms of his raw speed, if not necessarily for his ability to go through an entire race without throwing the car off the road. Teo Fabi, who again had a career in sports cars and F1, and again very highly regarded, and Mauro Boldi as well. So you're looking at proper proper driving royalty there. I don't think really you could have found a better suite of drivers to pilot this thing while it was being run by the Works outfit, and those were just the Italian drivers who they got to jump into the car. They also got Henry Pescarello, who competed with the LC2. I'll come on to him in a little while because some of his comments about the program are very interesting. So you can't really fault the driver lineup. Patrese at one point scored 3 pole positions on the bounce in this car, and it really showed the promise. So the car was capable of running quickly. There were 11 fastest laps throughout its competitive career. Clearly, it had the speed and the talent. So ultimately, when you're looking at this, yes, other teams did have their own top-level drivers, but I think when you're looking at it overall, nobody had, I think, a clear edge in terms of talent, and certainly Lancia were as well stocked as anybody out there. So why couldn't they take the speed and the talent behind the wheel and turn that into race wins and championship wins? And I think the answer comes down to how Lancia actually approached their racing program at the time. So to give you a bit of background to where we ended up, so basically how we got to this point, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Lancia still had a successful world sports car program. So under the Group 5 regulations, they ran the Beta Monte Carlo, which won 3 world titles, and won the manufacturer's title in 1981. In 1981. So for 1982, they bought in the Group 6 LC1, and they couldn't carry on racing that because of the regulation changes, moving to Group C. The LC1 was an open top. There needed to be closed canopy for 83 onwards if you wanted to actually score championship points. There was a crossover season in with the 82 season, when effectively anything could be run, but it was very much if you have an old car, this is its last hurrah, effectively. So in 1982 they won 3 races, which is as many as the LC2 won across its entire career, and Patrese nearly won the title driving one of these things. So how do we get from 82 through to 83? Now, because the regulations were changing, Lancia had to build a whole new car to comply with those regulations. If you've gone and watched my companion video where I take the car on a lap of the Nürburgring and give a few basic facts and figures, you'll know that the engine comes from a Ferrari 308, but it was twin turbocharged to boost its power output to around 820, 830 bhp, which is nothing to sneeze at. That was certainly not leaving it underpowered by any stretch of the imagination, but by the same token, they that wasn't an engine that was custom designed to getting a bit hairy there as I take to the grass. It was not an engine that was custom designed for this type of racing. They also paired that with an off-the-shelf gearbox from Hewland, and I'll come back to the gearboxes in a second because that was a frequent weak point of the car. The chassis was built by a combination of engineers from Abarth and Dallara, both of which you should know, because obviously Abarth is the branding effectively that Fiat puts on its hot versions of the Fiat 500, and Abarth was effectively a separate manufacturer in its own right for a time under the Fiat Group banner, bearing in mind that Fiat own Ferrari, Maserati, Lancia, and Abarth as well. So it was basically the Fiat Group coming together to put this car on the track. So Ferrari engine, Abarth helping with the chassis design. They also brought in the people from Dallara to assist with that, and you may know Dallara from the fact that they build the current chassis for IndyCar racing, and previously they've been in Grand Prix racing in the early 90s with the Scuderia Italia outfit. So there's definitely all of the right pieces there in terms of putting this thing together, but they built the whole thing in 8 months, start to finish. It was only ready for shakedown probably about a month before it had to start competing full time. And realistically, the fact that it was developed on a bit of a budget with off-the-shelf components that were sort of modified to fit was indicative of the fact that the car probably wasn't. Probably shouldn't have been taken out of the oven at the time it was. So to indicate this, Pirelli were tasked with building designing and manufacturing the tyres for this car. And when Ghinzani ran the car at Monza, there was a massive tyre blowout, which fortunately did not cause a more serious accident, but it was a matter of some debate as to why the tyre had failed and whether that was due to Pirelli simply not having the skills to put that together, which I very much doubt, or whether it was potentially the fact that the data that the car was generating was not being fed through to the Pirelli engineers correctly. A general lack of understanding there in terms of how to make a suitable race tyre for the car, and tyre problems plagued the Lancia throughout its competitive life. They switched from Pirelli to go to Dunlop, and that was probably because Pirelli weren't able to get the tyres up to spec as quickly as Lancia would have wanted. But the Dunlops were designed on a completely different cross-ply structure rather than radial, and again, the car wasn't designed to be used with Dunlop tyres, so they continued to struggle with that. They had more success after they then switched on to Michelin's later on in the car's competitive career, but again, you're looking at something where you certainly saw it with, say, for example, Bridgestone when they designed for Ferrari in the late 90s, early 2000s. And when you have car and tyre working in harmony, you can often go pretty damn quickly when everything is working together, and you've got a tyre manufacturer who's sympathetic to the needs of the car. This clearly didn't happen in the case of the Lancia. They were pretty much having to use whatever tyres they could that would last the correct amount of time. So that was the first problem. The second problem, and I'll go back to the gearbox again, is that because the reliability was somewhat suspect, they ended up having to try and use creative solutions to get the cars to last the distance, because they didn't really have the money or the time, possibly the expertise, to test everything to make sure that it was going to work. And so to look at the gearbox as an example, when these were run at Le Mans, it was a 5-speed box, but they would have 4th and 5th gear being the same ratio, and to try and prolong the longevity of the gearbox, they'd have one driver run 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th, and then the second driver would run 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 5th. And if it was a struggle for me to say it, imagine how that must have felt to the drivers driving those cars at the time. And it was really to reduce the strain on the top gear. But if you know anything about gearboxes and ratio spacing, it's not going to give your car the optimum performance if you're essentially having to handicap yourself by only giving the box effectively 4 gears to play with. So that was one thing, and even then it didn't stop the car developing gearbox problems on a number of occasions. The engine proved to be unreliable because it was running on UK spec petrol, so that was something that caused difficulties. There were problems with fuel pressure with the turbochargers, and this afflicted both the works cars and privateer entries as well. So overall, you're looking at something where the car had so many problems that it was difficult to probably focus on one area to actually get that working properly. So the fact that they had to design and build this new car within a span of 8 months obviously came back to bite them at a later stage. Coming straight out of the horse's mouth, you have Cesare Fiorio, who was the team manager at the time and later went on to be the boss at Ferrari, in a similar capacity. He said that, quite frankly, they didn't have the resources or the time to go and run a thorough development and testing program which would have seen the car's reliability and no doubt ultimate performance improve as well. They did improve the car, no doubt. They did carry out work to it to obviously keep it competitive, but they were really just trying to put sticking plasters on the problems, hence the fudge they did with the gearbox. So that was an issue. There was also the fact, and this is not to denigrate the work that the Lancia engineers did on the car, but Lancia had beforehand very much been a team that focused on rallying, and later on they doubled down on the rallying and shuttered the Group C program. And it was clear that if you were a top level engineer at Lancia, you invariably worked on the rally cars rather than on the Group C outfit. They didn't have the resources to run the same kind of operation that they did when they went rallying, and that's why I'm being very careful about how I phrase this, because I don't want to imply that effectively the Group C outfit were the B team effectively, but a combination of the focus on the rallying program, and clearly they would have had the pick of who they had on that program, meant that this was very much not the priority. Whereas for Porsche, for example, they went all in on Group C. They built the 956, the 962, developed those for years, and had a massively successful customer program where they sold those cars to not just teams competing in Europe, but also over in the States in the IMSA series as well. So it was very much a case of Porsche went all in on this, whereas Lancia were very much kind of hedging their bets. I don't necessarily think they had enough quality people there to run both programs, and that was borne out in 1987, where the Group B rally cars were effectively rendered obsolete because they were outlawed for being just too quick and too dangerous, effectively. And whilst they continued to successfully compete in things like the European Rallycross Championship and the British Rallycross Championship, they were no longer allowed to rally. Lancia needed to replace their very successful stable of Group B cars. Bearing in mind you'd had history with the Stratos, the 037, and the like. So you needed to bring something new to the table, and unfortunately, the new Group A regulations meant that they had to put all their resources in 1987 into building the Delta Integrale, which went on to become phenomenally successful. But it did mean that they didn't just give the Lancia sports car team the scraps, they just took the table away completely. So unfortunately, Lancia ended up ditching their works program for 1987. So 1986 was the last year this car competed as a works outfit. So over the course of this race, I've managed to drag my way up to 5th position overall, which is good. I mean, given the number of incidents I had over the 25 laps I ran. It's a very, very fun mod, this. Cars are nice to drive, they've got phenomenal grip. They don't seem to have the same top speed. I haven't been able to drag 200 miles an hour plus out of this, whereas in other mods I've been able to get it to go much faster. You'll see there 40 seconds off the pace, but 43 seconds off the pace, but who's counting? But overall, I feel quite pleased with that. Had a field of 32 cars just to make it so I'd always have at least somebody to battle with, but came relatively high up the order despite the mishaps. So so the other reason that Lancia weren't able to develop the car was simply because they had tried to divide and conquer, and as Ferrari proved in the 1970s, when they shuttered their sports car program, their Grand Prix team ended up being a lot more successful. Look at the comparison from 1973, when they actually missed several rounds of the championship because they were just in a complete muddle, through their comeback in 74, 75, and then all the way to the end of the 70s, when they won 3 drivers' titles and obviously won the constructors' title as well. I believe they won it in 76, even though Ladd lost the drivers' championship to Hunt. So again, I think the comment I want to jump to is that when Henry Pescarolo drove for the team, he felt that the philosophy was that as long as the car went fast, that was all they cared about, rather than necessarily having a car that was the most reliable. And if you've ever been a fan of Ferrari when they've been Grand Prix racing in the 80s and the 90s, and there is that familiar frustration that the Ferraris tended to look good, sound good, go fast, and then just basically spontaneously combust. If you've ever seen Nigel Mansell's car going up in flames in Phoenix or similar, you know that Ferraris would leak oil, grenade engines, all that kind of thing. And it felt very similar, that as long as the car could be seen to be going quickly, where it actually finished in the race was seen as less vital. So that for me, I think, kind of drove to the heart of the matter as to why this car didn't get the success it probably otherwise would have had it had a proper development program, like for example Nissan or Porsche or Mercedes or Jaguar for that matter. And it's a shame that the car didn't end up being developed over further years, because it could have potentially stayed competitive for another probably 3 or 4 years well into the twilight of the Group C era, as it was. The next bit of footage I'm going to jump to will show you when the very final version of the car was run, and for this I'm going to jump to GTR2, and I've done a couple of sighting laps and found that the car was incredibly twitchy, and the circuit was also very bumpy. So I'm going to try and fiddle around with the differential settings just to make sure that I can I don't suddenly have loads of snap oversteer. I'm also going to take some pressure and out of the rear, make it a bit softer, so hopefully I can get a bit more grip. I'm not going to really fiddle around with it too much, but I think if you do go and drive this mod, be aware of the bumps. See if you can soften the car up so it rides those better and then performs better under braking, because I did have some problems with this. It wasn't so much the turning, it wasn't so much the power, it was more the fact that I was struggling to get the car stopped, and then I was getting thrown off by bumps anywhere they occurred on the circuit. Not unsurprising given how low and how stiff Group C cars would have run, but worth bearing in mind. Now, as I say, this is the final version of the car. I think it looks glorious in this paint scheme. Really pretty car. You see it's badged as the Lancia Ferrari. Not the first car to have been badged accordingly. The Lancia Ferraris of 54 through 56 were the previous ones. So starting a hot lap now, because basically the outlap was full of me just not being particularly brilliant at driving. So going through Redgate Corner, and you'll see the car squirming on the bumps as I come down the crane of curves. On the brakes, trying to get it turned in. You see him have a bit of a nibble and correcting as the car's trying to break away. So I think overall, when looking at Lancia, it's very much a case of what if. I think, and realistically, if Lancia didn't have its rally program and had put everybody onto the LC2 program, I think they could have had some greater success. I don't think they could have really done much more to improve the driving lineup. I mean, they clearly proved that not only could they attract the finest talent from the top line of Italian motorsport, but they could also get other top line competitors such as Pescarolo into the team as well. So it wasn't a case of they were just simply ignoring anybody else that was out there. They were prepared to get other people into the car. And I think it's a shame that we never really got to see what this thing could do if it was fully funded and had proper shakedown work completed, rather than trying to patch it along the way. So looking at the mods that you can get to drive this car in various racing games, obviously I've done a Assetto Corsa when I took it around the Nürburgring. I did a 6:35 there, and I think the qualifying time, as I mentioned, was a 6:41 for the car when it first debuted in 1983. So pretty indicative, actually. I'm quite happy with that lap. And the Assetto Corsa version is probably the most up to date and the closest version you'll get at present. The rFactor version isn't necessarily indicative of the car because it is designed as a League Edition mod, so clearly I'm able to take that round faster, and I think it's probably more geared to the overall performance of the Porsche 956 and 962 rather than the Lancia specifically, and I think the times reflect that. I don't think I'm so much better at rFactor that I could find all those seconds of 27 seconds to lop off my times. Sorry, 17 seconds. I can't count. With this, I haven't taken this version from GTR2 on a similar lap of the Nürburgring. I may well do at some point in the future, but I'm just trying to try out some mods for GTR2 and get it working how I want before I frustrate myself trying to drive it round the ring. Because given it performs this badly over the bumps at Donington, the ring is just going to finish it off basically, and finish me off as well. So overall, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you've enjoyed the going through the history of the LC2. Certainly I had fun doing some research for the video, because this isn't a car that I really knew too much about. It was a car that I'd basically seen and thought it looked fantastic and really wanted to know more about it. So I'm glad that I've now been able to do the research, find out a bit more, and why sadly it didn't succeed. But I hope you've enjoyed coming along with me on that, and that you'll tune in for more of these videos in future. So for now, I'll sign out and see you next time for another one of these videos. That's been Drive Retro. Bye for now.